Timo Andres, welcome to Cultural Attaché.
Thank you, Craig. Great to talk to you.
I want to talk to you first about the world premiere that the LA Philharmonic is going to be giving of Made of Tunes, which they commissioned and which you composed with Aaron Deal in mind as the soloist. You knew it was going to be for him. What are the
That's
qualities?
right.
What are the qualities that Aaron Deal possesses as a pianist that most influenced how and what you composed for him?
That's a great question. I mean, whenever I write a piece for anyone, I'm trying to think of their specific qualities as a performer and how I can sort of highlight those and work with those and bring them out. And in the case of Aaron, he was someone who I knew well. I've known him about a decade now. I've heard him play many, many times. So his sound and his style was very much in my ear. And also his repertoire, because I think the music that he chooses to play and that he engages with is as much a part of his voice as anything. Um, and that really is kind of a broad history of American piano music going back to the earliest ragtime and kind of the stuff that we would pinpoint as saying like, oh, this music sounds American for the first time as opposed to European. Um, and that whole tradition is very inspiring to me as well. I've always felt myself to be specifically an American composer. Besides for that, I think Aaron has a wonderfully elegant approach to piano playing. It's very understated, but very expressive, and he's one of those pianists who you simply can't imagine him making an ugly sound on the instrument. Everything is sort of beautifully polished in that way, and he also has another quality which is extremely important to me in the performers I choose to work with, which is a great rhythmic integrity. Um, and of course, I think his background playing jazz has a lot to do with that. I think jazz um, sort of training and pedagogy and just sort of the embodiment of it as sort of a multiplicity of styles places a much greater emphasis on rhythm as an expressive tool than does classical training. And that's something I've always kind of had a little bit of a soapbox about, because I feel like that kind of rhythmic integrity is something that I very much use in my own music. So Aaron was an ideal person to write for in that way.
I'm glad you brought up his jazz background because I first saw Aaron perform with Cecile McLaurin Salvant, and
Mhm.
of course was massively impressed by his playing and his just the way his ear and his mind work in tandem to come up with these great improvised sections. And on your website, you say that Aaron's part includes opportunities for improvisation, sections in which I pass him a tune or rhythm or harmony, and he responds with something I wouldn't have thought of. How much freedom does he therefore have to improvise, which I guess is in the tradition of cadenzas going back to, even Beethoven's day. Beethoven was improvising his cadenzas. So what level of improvisation,
That's
allowance
true.
do
That's
you
true.
have?
I mean, it's a little bit of a different thing. I think in certain ways, what I've tried to do is a little bit trickier and a little bit certainly rarer, in that I don't actually have an improvised cadenza. The section that you would maybe call a cadenza is completely written out. And the improvised sections are actually um, playing with the orchestra. And that to me was sort of more interesting in a way because it's very much what one hears Aaron do when he's playing, with a singer or a trio or, um, in an ensemble. It's that responding to the other people, not just responding to the musical cues, but responding to what else is going on in the room. Now, the orchestra part is totally written out. That I, I I sort of had an idea that I would maybe be able to incorporate some improvised or aleatoric bits in the orchestra part, but it's really just too risky in terms of portability. You know, maybe you have some orchestra players in one particular orchestra who are comfortable with that sort of thing, but then you take it to a different group and maybe those people are not. So the orchestra is kind of remaining on course with the notated music, and then Aaron is I always sort of pass him something. So whether that's a chord or a series of chords or a sort of melodic motive or you know, literally just verbal instructions, you know. um I'm always giving him something to go on, and that is very much how improvisation typically works. You know, it's not this idea of like total freedom. You know, you're you're elaborating on the music, you're taking it in a different direction, you're using certain frameworks and then replacing the things on top of those frameworks with your own ideas. And that's I think the skill of a great jazz improviser, and that's kind of what I wanted to give Aaron the opportunity to do. So so yes, I'm always giving him some direction, and yet, you know, he's always surprising me with how he interprets those directions.
As you were composing the piece, were you allowing yourself to play with what some improvisations you might come up with if you were the soloist?
You know, I'm not an improviser. I do improvise as part of my compositional process sometimes, but it's not a huge part of it. Um, I think that's one of the things that kind of uh, fascinates me, and that I'm slightly in awe of with Aaron and you know, people who can really do that on such a high level, um, is the hearing it and just thinking like, I could not do that, like I don't know how to do that. So you know, maybe one day down the road, I will end up performing this piece myself, and in that case, I'm not quite sure what I'll do in those sections. I may give myself a little bit more of a written framework, um, leaving some flexibility for, you know, what may happen in performance. But I don't have that kind of uh, confidence to give myself that total freedom in front of other people.
Do you have the confidence to add socio-political statements in your work? And the reason I ask that is the description, you know, of Mative Tunes on your website. You talk about the second movement, American Nocturnal, having 6 variations of original theme. That was all taken from a mishmash of the notes used in the hokey patriotic song America the Beautiful. And I'm wondering, is that something that allows you to hold a mirror up to who we are as a country by taking those notes so closely associated with how we present ourselves patriotically?
You know, it's not something that I want to make explicit. I would say that the whole piece sounds very American to me. Um, and I think the way that the piece ends, um, which I almost feel like I should give a spoiler alert. Um, but the conclusion of the piece, I think, perhaps says more than I want to say uh, in words about that.
So people can draw their own conclusions.
I think when you hear what happens in the end, you can draw your own conclusions, and the I think the final kind of orchestral gesture, which is basically uh, basically feels apocalyptic, um, is yeah. I don't think I need to attach any sort of political grandstanding to that. I'll leave that to some of my other colleagues.
Fair enough. I read an interview that you gave the LA Times in 2009 when the LA Philharmonic was giving the premiere of Nightjar, and you mentioned that you were obsessed with John Adams, um, which I understand completely. And I know that the title for Made of Tunes is derived from a Charles Ives song, um, and not an homage to John Adams. But it does make one wonder, since he is conducting the premiere. This is a man who wrote a piano concerto, called "Must the Devil Have All the Good Tunes." Now you have your piece here. I'm just wondering, is there a wink and a nod to John Adams built into the title, or is it strictly Charles Ives?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, John has a piece called "My Father Knew Charles Ives," and I know as an admirer of Ives' songs, and my title is drawn from the lyrics to an Ives song called "The Things Our Fathers Loved." Um, so there's that. I mean, John John's music was and is a huge influence on me. It was something that, you know, when I wrote that first piece for LA Phil back in, I guess I must have written it in 2008, was something that was still very fresh in my ear. It was something that I was um, kind of still relatively new to. And I think you can hear it kind of right on the surface of the music that I was writing at that time. Um, Now, I think, well, we've both sort of developed and changed so much as composers, even over the past 15 years. Um, I think there's an aspect that we share in this sense of Americanness and this sense of a fluidity between all of these different kinds of music that make up the sort of American identity. Um, I think maintaining that fluidity is very important to both of us. Um, I think you'll hear a kind of rhythmic drive, especially in the first movement, that I very much think of as being something that I learned from John's music, and also on top of that rhythmic drive, a kind of playing with the distortion of it, playing with how the listener feels and hears that kind of sense of pulse. Um, and I think the kind of melodic invention of the second movement, of the slow movement, is there's also something in that from John's vocal writing, perhaps, um, this sense of kind of endless melody. Um, I think there's a lot in it that John, as we've kind of been working on the piece together, as he's been preparing it, that we've gone back and forth on, and that he's sort of discovered in it. And he actually told me yesterday that there's something in it that reminded him of a song of his from this show called "I Was Looking at the Ceiling and Then I Saw the Sky," which is sort of um, I guess a little bit of what you might call a cult classic among John's works. Um, and there are also a couple of kind of hidden references to um, our mutual friend Ingram Marshall, who is a figure who was equally influential on me, and who was a longtime friend of John's. And I think the reason that those references kind of found their way into the piece was that I knew it was a piece that John would be sort of intimately involved um, in the performance of.
Makes sense. Now, in that same story in the LA Times, you said of the LA Phil's commission of Nightjar, quote, if you had asked me what my absolute dream commission would be, I probably would have said something along those lines. I mean, it's Los Angeles. They're pretty much where it's at in terms of good music. How has your perspective evolved since that time and where you are today with this commission from the LA Phil?
Well, I mean, it really feels like part of the same journey in a way. I mean, that Green Umbrella commission was one of my first commissions, period, from anyone. And it happened when I was still in grad school, which was a really kind of it felt like a really kind of a vote of confidence in a way. And those were kind of I think slightly headier days in terms of where we felt that the American orchestral establishment might be headed. And I think, you know, with everything that's happened in the past few years, it seems like orchestras might be having a little bit of a tougher time. And in general, I see a kind of retrenchment into a kind of artistic conservatism that for someone like me who's a composer and a enthusiast of anything that's new, can be a little bit discouraging. But I do see the commission of this new concerto as kind of bucking that trend. I mean, it's my first subscription series appearance with the Phil, and my first piece that I've written actually for the full orchestra. They've commissioned a number of chamber orchestra and chamber pieces, but this is the first kind of for the whole group. And I mean, it's still a dream ensemble. I've over the years gotten to know many of the individual players in the orchestra from various different contexts, and even seen people from my cohort, from my generation, go on to join the orchestra, wonderful players at the top of their games. And so writing this piece, I was hearing not just Aaron, but various individual players whose work I've gotten to know over the years within the orchestra, which is a wonderful feeling. And I know it to be a group who are really open for anything. They're the most new music friendly of the major American orchestras by far, and I think the most comfortable with a lot of the kind of more demanding things that new music in general, and my piece particularly, asks of them. And so, yeah, I'm very sanguine about the coming week. I think it will. I think it'll be really fulfilling, and I'm really really excited to hear, the full canvas of the piece.
And it is a big week for you because you're recording The Blind Banister is coming out on the same day that this concerto is having its world premiere. And
That's right. Yeah.
and that's a piece that had its world premiere in 2016. So we're a number of years down the road from that. How has your relationship with that piece evolved, and how did that influence how you chose to perform it?
So the Blind Banister is my third piano concerto, and Made of Tunes is my fifth. So it kind of kind of a week of piano concertos here. The Blind Banister was also a piece that was written specifically for a particular soloist, in that case, Jonathan Biss. Very, very different artist from Aaron, and someone who I was equally enthusiastic about writing for. And I think that piece has much more to do with kind of maybe a classical style, a kind of classical romantic lineage, and how I place myself in that as a 21st century American. I actually just performed the piece last month 4 times in Oregon, and it's funny. I mean, that piece, I still like it. It's still I think a piece where I figured out certain things compositionally that I can sort of mark as a tent pole in my catalog in a way. I think formally, I tried some things in that piece that I had never tried before. It's kind of this continuous 20-minute stretch of music, which I think at the time was the longest continuous stretch of music that I had attempted to write. And I think in general, it succeeds at articulating that amount of time in a way that's compelling and that leads the listener through on a kind of journey. I would also say, as I've grown more comfortable with the performance of it and my own, both my own performance and working with orchestras on it, because it's been performed quite a few times now, probably the most of any of my orchestral pieces. It's a piece that just kind of works. It has its particular demands and difficulties and sections that are tricky to put together and balance. But the rhetoric of the piece and the formal journey of it kind of explain themselves, and the musicians, I found, generally latch on to them and kind of dig in a way that's really great to hear. And I think it's a piece that gives musicians challenging but satisfying parts that feel like real orchestral parts. They're not like, playing a little skittery scratch here and there and then like sitting quietly for, it's very important to me that, especially when I'm writing for orchestra, that players feel well utilized. And that's not to say that I'm like somehow retrenching myself, that I'm a conservative in my orchestral writing. But I think there's a balance between approaching the orchestra for what it is and for what it's good at and for what it can do, and then saying, oh, I'm an uncompromising composer. I need these 50, 60, 70 people to all just do what I say. It's like, I don't know. It's a question of, I think, empathy and a kind of like remembering you're dealing with a group of human beings.
Well, I hadn't heard the Blind Banister before I got in advance of the album, and I think people are going to be in for a very wonderful listening experience when they hear the album.
Thank you.
I think it's really terrific. As I think that listeners had a good time when they watched your Tiny Desk concert of Philip Glass's Etudes 6 and 5 in that order. You're also going to be performing at Walt Disney Concert Hall as one of 5 pianists doing Philip Glass's complete Etudes 1 to 20, and you also edited the published edition that came out. When you're working on something from an editorial perspective, are there new discoveries that you were able to make, new understandings that you make that are separate from what you understand as you're playing a piece of music?
That's a good question. I think I tend to Well, I'm someone who's very grounded in notation. You know, that I think already that sort of puts me in the minority of musicians in the world. You know, most music is not made uh via notation. Oh, sorry. Siri just started playing some music. Hey Siri, stop playing. Oh my God. I love being listened to by technology at every moment of my life
Yeah.
and misunderstood by it. Um, I think you know notation is really like how it's not only how I deal with music most of the time, but it's kind of inescapably how I think about it. Like when I hear music, I see notation and it and vice versa. So in a way, all the music that I interface with, I understand something more of it by seeing the notation. And very often, especially when I'm playing new work, um, I will actually go and renotate certain things. Not because it's like notated wrong or anything. It's just like there's certain things that I think I opinions that I hold aesthetically or taste wise or just from a practicality standpoint that are uh, sort of the differential between how a composer might think of a piece, might sort of conceive music, and then the ways that a pianist might approach that music um, physically or sort of think about it um, conceptually. And so I often find myself working with composers to kind of um, come to an agreement, meet somewhere in the middle with those two different um, perspectives, if that makes sense. Um, you know, with Philip, I think his notation always has a wonderful kind of clarity to it. So it wasn't so much about you know clarifying anything in particular. I mean, you can read these pieces off his hand notated manuscripts, you know, pretty much with no problem. Um, and this was more about kind of, I'd say, meeting somewhere in the middle between a totally literalized um, typesetting of those manuscripts and then reading from the manuscripts. Because I think there are aspects of both documents that are useful. Um, so it really was an exercise in practicality and aesthetics and usefulness, and along the way, you know, clarifying a few editorial things um, with the help of Philip's publishers, of course, and referring back to his manuscripts.
I want to finish our time by asking you about one other thing that you posted on your website, which was on January 4th of 2023. You wrote, "Thanks to all the artists and record labels who asked me to write about their recordings. Doing so always teaches me new ways to listen and think about music." If we fast forward 30 or 40 years and somebody is editing your work or asking to comment on them, what would you like them most to know about who you were at this particular time in your life as a person and as a composer and as an artist?
You know, I'm not really someone who likes to uh, I guess self mythologize or you know I don't think autobiographically, so that's it's not really a question I'm prepared to answer, and it's I don't think it's my job to answer it. I think of myself as someone who works very hard. I mean, my life is really about this work, all the different aspects of the work that I do, whether it's writing a piano concerto or playing the work of another composer or writing about the work of other musicians, arranging the work of other musicians, all of these different ways that I can sort of get my hands dirty with music, so to speak. I'm up for it. And I don't stop to really interrogate what my project is, in a sense, or even who I am. I don't know who I am. Do any of us really know who we are? I think that's more I think when you start to think about that, you're becoming your own publicist in a way. You're marketing yourself, which is, you know, it's a necessity in the modern world of simultaneously like constant pressure to be sharing content and sharing yourself online, and simultaneously the complete destruction of any kind of critical apparatus in the mainstream press, or any kind of real critical discourse that goes on in the mainstream, um, certainly in the field that I work in. Uh, and so it's tempting to try to pick up the pieces and try to do it yourself in that way. And I have a website, I have Instagram, I have Twitter, I do all these things. Um, but I also don't know if they truly say anything about who I am as an artist. I think I would rather leave it to the professionals to come to their own conclusions.
Or let the music speak for itself.
Well, it's a little bit cliche to say, I guess, but yeah, I mean, I do think, yeah, listen to the music. Like if you're curious, like it's all in there. I don't think it says anything, again, like I don't think it says particularly anything autobiographical. I'm not that kind of composer. Um, but I think you can connect the dots, if you really listen.